We saw another big sell-off on Wall Street today. It was the worst one-day loss for the S&P 500 since June 2020. It fell 165 points, 4%. The Dow dropped 1,164 points, 3.6%. The Nasdaq lost 566 points, 4.7% today. And Wells Fargo's CEO says the worst is yet to come for Americans. He expects an economic recession. He says the recession, though, will only be mild, that consumer spending is still strong. Note those comments came before Target's weak earnings today. Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to fight inflation, but this could slow the economy into an economic downturn. So, Fed's chairman wants to navigate a, quote, soft landing as it raises rates, but recently admitted that won't be so easy. Wells Fargo isn't alone in thinking we're heading for a recession. Conference Board survey found a majority of CEOs feel the same way. It said, quote, CEO confidence weakened further in the second quarter as executives contended with rising prices and supply chain challenges. Target CEO today said it sees no end in sight for those rising prices. And with us live is the founder of Euro Pacific Capital, Peter Schiff. Peter, thanks for coming on. When we talk about a recession in 2022 or 2023, what exactly are you expecting?
Well, first of all, I think the recession has already started. I think we're in it now. It's just early. In fact, the first quarter was already a negative print. And I don't think it's going to be a mild recession. I think this recession is going to be worse than the Great Recession that started following the 2008 financial crisis. So, and remember, the government didn't see that one coming either. And in fact, when we were 6 or 7 months into that recession, the Federal Reserve and other economists still claimed that there was no recession anywhere in sight. So this recession is going to be much worse than that one. And what's going to make it particularly problematic is inflation, because inflation is actually going to be exacerbated by the recession. So Americans are going to have the worst of both worlds, a worse recession than the Great Recession of '08, but worse inflation than anything we experienced during the 1970s.
So let's take it part by part, Peter. So first of all, we hear the banks are well capitalized this time. They're stronger this time. How could it be a worse recession than 2008?
Well, that's what they said last time, right before the financial crisis. They said the banks were in great shape. Look, the banks are only in good shape until the value of their collateral collapses and people can't repay their loans. That's what happened in the last financial crisis. This one is going to be even bigger because the economy has a lot more debt now than it had in 2008. And Americans are less able to pay it when interest rates rise because the balances are much greater. So we're in much worse shape as a result of all the bailouts and all the stimulus that papered over the last crisis. And so now the one we're dealing with is going to be much worse because we kicked the can down the road instead of solving the problems when we had a chance.
Is there a remedy or is the damage already done?
Well, there's a remedy, but it's not without pain. And unfortunately, it's the middle class and the poor that are going to feel the pain the most. Because if the Fed fights inflation, it's middle class and poor people who are going to suffer the most during the inflation fight. If they don't fight inflation because they think they want to spare the middle class the pain of a horrible recession, well, then they're going to suffer even more with massive inflation.
I want to note for the viewers as well, Peter, before the 2008 crisis, you were one of the only ones who did predict it and were warning people at the time, just to give some context. Let's look at the stock market today. How much further can stocks drop by your calculation?
Well, they can drop a lot farther, and they will drop a lot farther until the Fed does an about-face and acknowledges how weak the economy is. See, the Fed is only pretending it's going to fight inflation because it's also pretending that the economy is strong enough to withstand the fight. It's not. Even though the fight is inadequate to solve the inflation problem, it's going to cause a big problem for the economy that is so levered up on debt. And in fact, you talked about the Target earnings. Earnings are collapsing because Target customers are spending all their money on food. And Target doesn't make big profits selling food. It makes profits selling other goods that Americans are now too poor to afford. And so the bad news is now Target has to really raise prices even more, especially for food.
The inflation problem, if you look at businesses and earnings, they performed well last year, right, with the stimulus, et cetera. It looks like they're getting completely burned at both ends between rising costs and then demand destruction as people can't afford to pay for the stuff, like you said.
Exactly. And, when you have people like Elizabeth Warren claiming that the businesses are gouging the customers, they're not. They're actually not raising prices enough. They have to raise prices more because the businesses have been taking a hit in their margins. And yes, they're going to have to prepare for reduced sales at higher prices because customers don't have the money. And that's when the layoffs begin. See, that's the problem. As companies have to downsize because their customers can't afford their products, those businesses can't afford their workers. And so we're going to get rising inflation and surging unemployment at the same time.
We're seeing layoffs with major companies already, as you said. So, Peter, what should regular Americans do?
Stock up on the stuff that they need now while they can still afford it. I mean, prices are going to go much higher for basic necessities, but eventually the government's going to have price controls, and that means a lot of these necessities won't even be available. You think we have shortages now, wait till you see how bad they get when government imposes price controls. So my advice is to shop now, buy what you can while it's still on the shelves and before prices go even higher.
Got about 30 seconds, Peter. You really think the government is going to apply price controls? How would that look?
Well, it would look horrible. I mean, we did it in the 1970s. Why wouldn't they do it again? The government has a history of repeating its mistakes. It never learns from them.
Just want to say gold held up today, Peter, amid all the sell-off. Peter Schiff, Euro Pacific Capital. Thank you, Peter.
Sure thing.